Griffin to Global, SCAD's past meets present. Stepping out of a day filled with broken arrows and bent spears felt like being demoted from New Sea Flash to Scon Alert. My grand expedition had taken me from the strategic anxieties of the Cold War through the phantom echoes of my disastrous arrival 2 decades prior and deposited me directly in front of a tea room, a tactical downgrade of the highest order. The Griffin Tea Room sits across from my old college, a beautiful anachronism owned by the Savannah College of Art and Design and staffed by its students. It felt like walking into a pop-up book about a more civilized era. 15 years ago, I'd conducted a brief reconnaissance mission here involving tea, cake, and whipped cream. Back when I was a student, sinking under the weight of tuition and bad decisions, I never dared go inside. This time, I crossed the threshold. The food was excellent. Tea steamed in the stained glass light like tiny, well-mannered ghosts. The college itself looked familiar, and then it didn't. When I attended SCAD, I didn't know a single Indian student. Now it seemed every shop and cafe was staffed by them. It wasn't a jarring shift so much as the feeling that the rest of the world had finally received its dinner invitation. This global migration felt like a natural extension of the school's founding DNA. SCAD was always built for the practical arts, not the fainting couch. The whole enterprise was cooked up in 1978 by a quartet of founders, one of whom, Paula Wallace, legendarily sold her VW Beetle to help secure the first building. The school then proceeded to spread itself across the city with the cheerful, acquisitive ambition of a hedge fund, collecting historic structures the way a certain generation collected Pokémon. We walked past Poeta Hall, once the headquarters for graphic design and my personal purgatory. In my day, it had a certain patina that elegantly straddled the line between historic and mop shortage. Now it has been completely renovated into a gleaming welcome center, a showcase for the SCAD story. Same space, better lighting, conspicuous lack of existential despair. When I mentioned I was an alumnus, the students at the desk were genuinely pleased, a small kindness that improved my day out of all proportion to the effort involved. Then nostalgia hit me like a well-aimed portfolio. This was where I had my final review, the one that decided if I graduated. I was walking the same floorboards like a ghost who had prepaid his haunting fees. The old hall was a glorious, creaky affair. It had a magnificent smell of old wood, turpentine, and probably a hint of asbestos. The grand staircase groaned its way up to the sweltering third-floor classrooms, and every footstep produced a deep, resonant creak, a structural sigh that was more like music than a maintenance issue. They don't build them like that anymore, which is probably for the best. But I miss the sound. The building began its life in 1892 as the Savannah Volunteer Guards Armory, its large-span interiors designed for drills and balls, making it surprisingly adaptable for art students who require a similar amount of open space for their own dramatic maneuvers. Walking that floor again knocked loose a memory about money, which is the official currency of all art school anxiety. I had taken the GRE, just missing a scholarship that would have covered a full quarter of my 3-quarter master's program. For my second attempt, I studied less and performed worse. A strategy not generally recommended by guidance counselors. I hesitated to submit the scores, but there was a slim chance I'd done well on the highly subjective writing portion. I had written something about economics, viewing the problem from so many angles I practically turned it inside out. I sent it in. Heard nothing. Of searching, someone pointed. "Oh, you're the one who owes the school money." I shuffled back to the front of the line. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your name." The principal stepped forward. "I'm afraid we've been unable to locate your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it out of my pocket and handed it to her. "I'm afraid I can't find your name." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't find your account. Please provide your student ID number." I dug it of searching. Someone pointed. "Oh, you're supposed to be over here," she said, gesturing to a much shorter, happier-looking queue. "That's the line for free money." The essay had landed. That was then. Today, undergrad tuition is nearly $45,000 a year, with room and board approaching another 20. I paid about 10 grand for my entire 9-month degree. Even the numbers tell a story of ambition and time. The cake was gone, the tea was cold, and the day still had a few hours of Savannah left in it. We stepped back into the grid Oglethorpe had drawn nearly 3 centuries ago, its squares unspooling ahead of us like chapters in a book I'd once read too quickly. Squares to skirmishes, Savannah's revolutionary loyalties divide. Fortified by tea and alumni pride, my wife and I set out across the squares like minor nobility on a municipal pilgrimage. Live oaks arched over us in green vaults. The iron fences looked freshly stern, and somewhere a trolley dinged as if to announce our progress to the ages. Our first stop was the Georgia State Railroad Museum, where the locomotives sit like siege engines parked between campaigns. I have a soft spot for machines that solved problems with heat and stubbornness, and these brutes were built for both. The air tasted of oil and old steel. Sunlight slid along boiler rivets. A switch lever clanked in the distance, a small metal hymn to punctuality. Standing beside the engines, I felt that familiar itch to declare myself chief engineer of something I didn't remotely understand. From that echoing roundhouse, we walked back into the grid and, almost by accident, crossed the ground where the Battle of Savannah once tried to rearrange the city's future. A tidy plaque told an untidy story. In 1779, the British held Savannah and beat back a French-American assault with grim efficiency. The siege was international and costly, the result a victory for the crown and a city transformed from royal capital to fortified prize. The remarkable thing is how invisible it all is now. Car horns, dog leashes, a delivery truck exhaling at a red light, and beneath it, the ghost of an earthwork. The South's Revolutionary War was less a distant fight with a king and more a neighborhood argument that escalated into a bonfire. We touched on Thomas Burnfoot Brown earlier, back when we were nosing around the Turks and Caicos, and he returns here as the kind of figure history writes with a scar. Brown was a British-born planter who'd thrown his weight behind royal order in coastal Georgia and the backcountry. In 1775, near Augusta, patriots grabbed him. They fractured his skull. They tarred and burned him. He lost 2 toes. The nickname stuck, like the injuries. Instead of disappearing into a safer life, he organized refugee Loyalists into the East Florida Rangers and later the King's Rangers. A man whose loyalty was no longer a debate so much as a diagnosis. Across the square, another story walked in step with his. John Dooley, before he was a Patriot colonel, tried to keep the Crown's peace in 1774 for practical reasons. He and other frontier delegates went to Tondy's Tavern in Savannah to submit a protest. Their case was simple. Out on the edges, you wanted courts that worked, land titles that held up, and a governor, James Wright, who could keep people from being killed. Boston's lofty pamphlets didn't fix a fence post. When the rebels wouldn't hear them, Dooley and neighbors signed pro-British petitions that ran in the Georgia Gazette. Elijah Clark put his name on one too. Before gunpowder, these were men trying to keep the county file cabinet organized. About 50 Creek warriors ambushed a party that included Dooley's brother, Thomas, and killed him. It happened on land just open to settlement, and the message was not subtle. Waiting on royal solutions meant more risk, not less. That was Dooley's turn. He stepped into the new order as a deputy surveyor, then Wilkes County militia colonel and sheriff. Someone who traded petitions for muskets and tried to build civil order under a state government that was making itself up in real time. Brown and Dooley were not abstractions. They were neighbors with opposite conclusions. One became a Loyalist commander seared into his cause, anchoring royal control in a region where the Crown still had teeth. The other became a patriot leader shaped by frontier violence and the simple need for working institutions. Their commands would find each other in the Georgia backcountry, which is a polite way to say they came into conflict and the countryside paid the bill. In a world where committees could tar you and courts might not exist next Tuesday, the local enforcement arm of revolution sometimes looked less like liberty and more like a rebellion HOA. We stood there, 2 modern pedestrians squinting at a quiet square that once roared, and I tried to reconcile a city famous for shade and manners with a past that didn't ask permission. The trains had spoken in iron and steam, the plaque spoke in careful verbs, and Savannah, elegant as ever, kept its counsel. I took one step off the curb to see the marker better and learned a final truth about battlefields in busy towns. Spotting the exact spot doesn't make you a historian. It makes you the guy blocking a bike lane while a courier rings his bell at you like you owe him rent. The question the plaque didn't answer, of course, was why any of it had happened here at all. Georgia was the youngest colony, the most recently prosperous, and arguably the least enthusiastic about picking a fight with the empire that had bankrolled it. From right to flight, Georgia's brief royal resurgence. So there we stood, 2 tourists squinting at a quiet square that had once roared with bayonets and bad intentions, left with a rather large question. How does an entire colony become so comprehensively split that neighbors who once borrowed sugar are suddenly burning down each other's houses? Georgia's entry into the American Revolution was less a heroic leap into the fray and more the reluctant shuffle of the youngest sibling being dragged into a family argument it wanted no part of. While Boston was hosting its famous tea-dumping incident and Philadelphia buzzed with revolutionary chatter, Georgia was doing quite well for itself, thank you very much. The colony was prospering under Wright. who was surprisingly popular as royal governors went. Along the coast, especially in Savannah, the influential citizens were staunch king's men. This wasn't high-minded loyalty to the abstract concept of monarchy. It was simple arithmetic. The colony's economy of rice and indigo depended on British ships and on the institution of slavery, which, after the original trustees' ban, had been legalized and was now the engine of coastal wealth. Declaring independence was like asking a successful shipping magnate to set his own fleet on fire. Not everyone was getting rich. Out in the back country, a scrappy faction of patriots, or Whigs, if you prefer the formal attire, began to emerge. These were the John Dooleys of the world, folks who felt the sting of frontier life more than the comfort of royal protection. They formed their own provincial congress, and, in a fit of administrative inspiration, a council of safety. This council, a sort of emergency steering committee for the budding rebellion, convened for the first time on July 4, 1775. A date with a certain karmic resonance, as if they were holding a dress rehearsal for a party exactly 1 year before the main event. The council's primary job description seemed to be making the governor's life difficult. They placed Wright under house arrest in January 1776, an act that sounds terribly dramatic until you learn he rather easily escaped to a British warship a month later, ending royal authority with a quiet slip out the back door. The council also took it upon themselves to police loyalty, which led to the banishment of the Presbyterian pastor John J. Zubly. His crime was opposing a full declaration of independence, transforming him into the revolution's designated wet blanket. The one guy telling everyone to turn the music down while they were trying to found a nation. This patriot-led interlude, however, was short-lived. Savannah's strategic port was too valuable to ignore, and on December 29, 1778, the British Southern Strategy arrived by sea. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, a Scot who had sailed from New York, landed his men a couple of miles below town and simply rolled over the thin American defensive line. The victory was so swift and complete that it allowed the erstwhile fugitive Governor Wright to return the following July. He unpacked his bags and resumed his duties, making Georgia the only one of the 13 colonies to be successfully de-revolutionized and briefly re-crowned. The political equivalent of being sent to your room only to have your parents apologize and say you were right all along. I was still processing this when we walked away from the old battlefield site, past a law firm whose billboard promised aggressive representation in slip and fall cases. The same breed of billboard I'd noticed driving into town. A whole ecosystem of legal advertising in a city once designed to function without a single attorney. All that conflict, the loyalties, the betrayals, the return of the once deposed governor, was fundamentally an argument over who got to write the rules. 2.5 centuries later, the direct descendants of Oglethorpe's lawyer-free utopia were arguing over herniated discs and insurance settlements. Once you decide to have a country, the arguments never really stop. They just get a lot more specific. But in 1779, the argument was still being conducted with cannon. Wright was back in his governor's chair, the British garrison was dug in, and the question was no longer whether Georgia could be taken from the crown. The question was whether anyone could take it back. A day too generous. Savannah bleeds, Charleston beckons. Still chewing on Georgia's brief recrowning, because nothing says revolution like hitting undo. I walk to the Spring Hill Redoubt, where the grass lifts into low, stubborn humps, and the plaque speaks in neat sentences that don't sweat. Standing there, trying to read earthworks like tea leaves, I could almost see the fall of 1779 line up on the rim of the field like extras waiting for their cue. The Allies certainly brought the cast. A French fleet under Admiral Comte d'Estaing hove in with 4,000 troops from the Caribbean, and General Benjamin Lincoln arrived with the Continentals, equal parts brave and overdue. D'Estaing demanded the city's surrender. British Commander Augustin Prévost replied with a 24-hour request to consider, a word that should always travel with quotation marks when cannons are nearby. The Admiral, being a gentleman at a very ungentlemanly moment, granted the pause, polite as a duel at 10 paces. The pause did what pauses do. It made room for someone else's line. Lieutenant Colonel John Maitland marched through bad ground and worse water to slip into town with reinforcements, while British engineer Captain James Moncrief went to work. Using the forced labour of enslaved people, he threw up redoubts and batteries at speed, 12-hour days. Quiet hands building loud things, until, as the French admitted with a mix of grudging respect and headache, the English engineer made his batteries spring up like mushrooms in a night. The defences were real. The bill for them was too. A long bombardment followed, and then, on October 9th, 1779, the frontal assault. It went about as well as frontal assaults usually go. Allied casualties ran somewhere between 800 and 1,000. The British lost roughly 150. As I read the numbers, a freight train horn from the old rail yard rolled across the site, one long, iron-throated note that sounded like a delayed salute and a warning at the same time. The fight pulled in half the Atlantic world. Count Casimir Pulaski, the Polish cavalry hero, was hit by grape shot leading a charge and died 2 days later aboard the brig Wasp. The Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue, more than 500 free men of colour from the French Caribbean, charged here too. One of them, Henri Christophe, later crowned himself King Henri I of Haiti, then ended his life by his own hand rather than let his people do it for him. Savannah has a way of handing out resumes with footnotes. The failed siege kept Savannah firmly in British hands, and by 1780 they were well set to take Charleston. Loyalists like Colonel Thomas Burnfoot Brown and his King's Rangers helped hold the line here. The same man I'd met in the archives as a tarred and toed cautionary tale made flesh. Both sides called it strategy. The ground called it Tuesday. Tavern to garrison, Savannah's royal rule and retreat. The worst part of any failed surprise party is what comes next. The long, awkward clean-up with all the people you were trying to surprise. After the Franco-American assault collapsed on October 9, 1779, the Allies limped away, and the city didn't just lick its wounds. It was forced into a 43-month cohabitation with the victors. The British, having successfully fended off the attack, settled in for a long stay, transforming Savannah from a rebellious colonial port into a fortified supply depot for their southern strategy. Which sounds less like a military plan and more like a regional cookbook that's a little too proud of its mayonnaise. I'd already read about Governor Wright's return in 1779, making Georgia the only colony to be briefly recrowned, and standing at the redoubt it was easy to see why. The defences Moncrief had thrown up weren't going anywhere, neither were the British. Wright governed a city that functioned less as a provincial capital and more as a military base surrounded by countryside teeming with angry patriots. One imagines his daily duties were less about policy and more about making sure the Loyalists and the Hessians didn't drink from the same well. The garrison wasn't just redcoats and hired German professionals. It was bolstered by American Loyalists, men who had been burned by the Revolution in ways that weren't metaphorical. Burnfoot Brown, whose story I'd already traced from the tarring to his King's Rangers command, was among them, still collecting on a debt he'd been owed since the Patriots fractured his skull. Fighting alongside a man called Burnfoot must have been a constant grim reminder that for some, this wasn't a war of abstractions. It was personal, a chance to get even with the neighbours who had wronged them. Even Tondy's Tavern, the very nerve centre of patriot plotting, was co-opted, its revolutionary fervour replaced by the clinking glasses of occupying officers. The war settled into a grinding stalemate. Savannah was a British island in a sea of American resentment, a status quo that held for 2 years until a man with a suitably dramatic nickname decided to change the scenery. General Mad Anthony Wayne arrived in early 1782, and rather than attempting another grand, bloody assault, he opted for a campaign of strategic annoyance. His small continental force didn't try to take the city. They harried its supply lines, picked off scouting parties, and defeated Creek allies in the field. It was the military equivalent of a younger sibling holding their finger an inch from your face and chanting, "I'm not touching you." Wayne's persistent pressure slowly choked the city, making it impossible for the British to forage or scout beyond their own defensive lines. This slow strangulation, more than any climactic battle, hastened the decision to evacuate. In war, as in my chaotic first arrival in Savannah years ago, sometimes the biggest problems aren't solved by a single heroic act, but by methodically dealing with a swarm of smaller, deeply irritating ones, like a plague of tiny grass frogs at your door. Still, evacuation was one thing. The question of what to do with the men who'd been fighting each other, sometimes literally neighbor against neighbor, was another. Brown and the patriots he'd spent years trying to kill weren't just going to shake hands and split a pitcher at Tondi's. The war had developed its own customs for managing captured enemies, borrowed from older European practice, and those customs had a name: parole. Bound by word, Parole's perils in Georgia. Next to the old British earthworks, or what's now a very polite patch of lawn where dog walkers hold the line, I squinted at a parking sign that granted me 2 hours of freedom. It felt right. Savannah once specialized in freedom with footnotes. The city that held fast after the failed Allied assault also ran on a quieter system that kept enemies close and paperwork closer. I met Parole first on paper, the way one meets most old soldiers, under glass, in tidy script, with rules that can still bark. In the Revolutionary War, it meant conditional liberty, mainly for officers, granted on a sworn promise recognized by both sides. Give your parole of honor, and you could leave close confinement. In return, you would not escape. You would not bear arms, and you would obey the written terms until formally exchanged. A paper leash with legal teeth. Those teeth were precise. Parole certificates laid out the bounds like a surveyor with an attitude, often a city or district, sometimes the very hours you could step outside. Bureaucracy had range and a curfew. Break the oath, and you didn't just earn a stern talking to, you risked severe punishment. Even execution, if later caught with a weapon in your hand. The captors gained room in their prisons, spared themselves outbreaks and bread shortages, and saved labor and resources. Officers gained a life under city limits rules or house arrest instead of a stockade. Some agreements even paid subsistence, 3 shillings sterling for officers, while that conditional liberty lasted. The honor system, yes, but with a hangman's backup plan. I traced that honor through the war's grim middle, where the South behaved like a family argument with drums. In June 1780, when Royal forces held Augusta and Savannah was settling into its long stretch as a fortified hub, Patriot Colonel John Dooley surrendered his Wilkes County militia and went home on parole. On the frontier, that read like a truce. Guns cooled. Neighbors tried manners, everyone hoped the storm might pass. But the ink was barely dry when London's policy elbowed into the room. On June 3, 1780, General Sir Henry Clinton ordered former Patriot militia on parole to swear new oaths and actively serve in Crown militias. One set of rules revoked, another imposed. What had been a ceasefire became forced loyalty delivered by proclamation. The effect was gasoline on embers. Paroled officers who had accepted quiet suddenly carried the weight of a new oath they hadn't agreed to. Dooley lived in that pressure cooker. By August 6, 1780, he was dead. Murdered on or after that date, No tidy exchange, no ceremonial return. Just the grim frontier arithmetic that appears when rules shift faster than people can. Standing in the heat of Wright Square, where live oaks drip and traffic murmurs past, I could feel why Parole worked, until it didn't. By the next summer, the same machinery spun again, this time without the betrayal. In June 1781, after the surrender at Augusta flipped the local chessboard, Loyalist Colonel Thomas Brown and his garrison were sent under escort downriver to Savannah. The city had become both fortress and filing cabinet, secure, supplied, and perfect for a prison hub where officials could watch you, count you, and, most important, trade you. Other names, and the leash unclipped other names, and the leash unclipped. Under the customs of war, he was free to return to service for the crown, and he did it with energy, raising another regiment of Rangers and skirmishing against Wayne's Continentals outside the city in early 1782, just as the pressure from Wayne tightened the ring we've already traced. Savannah's version of Parole made sense in a garrison town that had to be both a sword and a ledger. The captors thinned their prison rolls. The prisoners paced their boundaries like men doing long time. The whole thing rested on the old European idea that an officer's oath meant something even when it hurt. And in this city, it often did. If that sounds absurd, were they really just letting trained enemies walk around town? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, conditional liberty existed. I could almost hear the shuffle of boots on Bay Street constrained by ink. But no, it wasn't loose. It was tightly documented, recognized by both armies, and enforced. Brown's return to the field came only after formal exchange ended his parole. Those who broke faith risked the rope. My meter chirped its 2-hour warning, another small contract come due, and I moved along, obedient to my own leash. The British by now were running out of reasons to stay. Plaques and Patriots. Savannah after the Redcoats. Savannah did not end its British era with a blaze of glory. It ended with a calendar invite. On July 11, 1782, after nearly 43 months of occupation, the city was handed back to American authority not by a last stand but by a planned withdrawal. Yorktown had knocked the wind out of the Crown's plans, and Wayne's tightening ring outside the city made the port more liability than lifeline. Even redcoats, it turns out, can read the room. The evacuation was neat, almost polite. Brigadier General Allard Clark took the main body north to New York. Brown, the same Burnfoot Brown I'd met earlier in the Ledger of Parole, who had sat in this city under paper limits, been exchanged, and returned to the field with fresh Rangers, now led those Rangers and his native allies south to St. Augustine. It was part of a broader Loyalist exodus from the Low Country, a migration conducted with the resigned efficiency of men who had packed this wagon before. When the British sailed, Wayne's Continentals came in, less like conquerors than locksmiths restoring the original key. They secured the town and returned Georgia to its Republican government, closing one set of books and opening another. It felt as tidy as a muster roll, finally balanced. I walked to the northwest corner of Broughton and Whitaker, where a plaque marks the spot of Tondy's Tavern, once the club room of the Liberty Boys, then a fixture of Royal Command during the occupation, and now a warm square of metal on a brick wall. The plaque gave off that faint penny smell under my fingers. A nearby candy shop sent a drift of sugar and butter into the street, which felt thematically appropriate for a revolution decided by logistics. Cars hissed over the crosswalk, and somewhere a gull heckled like a partisan with time on his hands. The war was over here, but wars leave different receipts depending on which side of the ledger you signed. Brown headed south into exile. Dooley was already dead, murdered 2 years earlier after the rules shifted under his feet. Standing at the corner where the Liberty Boys once toasted independence, I thought about what the frontier did to men who chose opposite oaths and then had to live, or not, with the consequences. Patriot and planter, Georgia's dueling revolutionary legacies. Standing at that corner, plaques radiating heat like little iron stoves, I kept turning the same question the prior hour had left me. Two men who fought opposite sides of the same messy war. One folded into Georgia's family album, the other pressed into a passport. Duly ended in a county name and battlefield lore. Brown ended on a dock, boarding south. Patriot and Loyalist, honor and exile. Same war, opposite weather. Duly lived where law and gunpowder shared a desk. In Wilkes County, he was a militia colonel, a sheriff, and the state's attorney in treason cases, trying to stitch together civil order while still riding to the sound of the guns. That line felt exactly right in the humid square where I stood, half courthouse, half ambush. His high-water mark came on February 14, 1779, at Kettle Creek, when he rode with Elijah Clark and Andrew Pickens and broke a Loyalist column that had been rolling up the backcountry. It kept Patriot resistance alive in the interior, a small victory that rang loud. Then came the royal resurgence of 1780, and the rules turned to fog. Dooley took British parole in June. A calculated pause in a world that didn't pause. Sometime on or after August 6th, Loyalist raiders murdered him at home. People later called it a Georgia parole, a bitter joke built on shifting rules and frontier vengeance. If you need a footnote for the war being a messy civil war, there it was, written in a cabin doorway. Decades later, the families who had fought that low, mean war made their verdict. In 1821, they named Dooley County for him, slotting a fallen militia colonel beside big names as if to say, "This is the man who kept the interior from slipping." Standing in Savannah, nowhere near that county, I could still feel the pull of those upriver loyalties, quiet, stubborn, and carved into maps. Brown carried the other half of the story, forged by pain and duty. He was called the most formidable Loyalist in the region, and he did not argue. His Kings, Carolina Rangers, helped hold the line during the 1779 defense of Savannah, while he also served as superintendent for Creek and Cherokee affairs, proof that the Crown measured the southern frontier with native alliances in mind. I'd already traced his thread through the parole system, the exchange, the late skirmishes around the city's edges. What I hadn't followed was where the road bent after July 1782. It bent south, and it kept bending. From St. Augustine, Brown reassembled a life in the British Caribbean, first on Turks and Caicos, later on St. Vincent, where he turned planter and builder. This last chapter was grim proof that imperial economics didn't end in 1783, right down to the tunnel he drove with enslaved labor to hurry sugar to a wharf. The nickname Burnfoot had been earned in blood long before. The scar traveled with him like a private seal. If you want the long Caribbean ledger, it's in my book on Turks and Caicos. The short version is that Brown's war never really ended, and he physically suffered for his loyalty to king and country for the rest of his life. So Savannah, newly back in American hands, left me weighing a clean evacuation against dirty memories. Dooley took a path that ends in a courthouse and a county map. Brown took a road that ends in salt, cane, and exile. One name was planted, one was uprooted. I stepped off the square, past a live oak that had grown fat on neutrality, and turned toward lunch as if it were an armistice. Two men fought. Georgia remembered only one. But Georgia wasn't the only country that lost soldiers in these streets. The 1779 siege had drawn men from half of Europe and the Caribbean, and some of them never left. From Brandywine to Savannah, Pulaski's charge and identity. Some of them never left, and the most famous rests a few squares south in Monterey Square, under a monument that sparked one of the stranger forensic cases in American history. Count Casimir Pulaski arrived in the colonies with a letter of introduction and a cavalry sword. He died on a ship off Savannah 2 years later. Between those 2 points fits a life so overstuffed with rebellion, exile, debt, and battlefield glory, that the biggest surprise turned out to be the one hiding in his own bones. Pulaski was born in 1745 to Polish aristocracy, which in the 18th century meant politics was a blood sport conducted in the saddle. His father was a leader of the Confederation of Bar, a coalition of nobles whose primary mission was telling the Russian Empire to kindly get off its lawn. Young Casimir got swept up in the family business of rebellion and became a gifted cavalry commander. Unfortunately for him, the business went bankrupt. His side lost the king, who Pulaski's faction viewed as little more than a Russian HR manager, slapped a death sentence on him, and he was forced into exile. Having failed to save one country, he did what any hunted, debt-ridden European aristocrat would do. He went to France. It was in Paris, after a brief stint in debtor's prison, that he had the good fortune to run into Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, serving as America's chief talent scout abroad, saw in Pulaski a man with a very particular set of skills acquired over a long career of vexing imperial powers. He gave the Polish officer a letter of introduction to George Washington, and by 1777 Pulaski was sailing for the New World, presumably hoping this revolution would go better than his last. He wasted no time making the case. At the Battle of Brandywine, with the Continental Army in a full-blown every-man-for-himself retreat, Pulaski organized a rearguard action so effective it saved George Washington's hide and prevented a total collapse. Washington basically handed him the keys to every horse in the army, making him a brigadier general and the first ever commander of the American Cavalry. He later formed the Pulaski Legion, a motley crew of American, German, French, Irish, and Polish volunteers. It sounded less like a military unit and more like the opening of a tavern story. An Irishman, a German, and a Pole ride into a British camp. But under Pulaski's leadership, they became a serious fighting force, often bankrolled by the general himself, who apparently saw funding your own troops as just another part of the job description. His final act came during that same botched October 1779 assault I'd already traced through D'Estaing's disastrous truce and the fortified killing ground it produced. In the chaos near the Spring Hill redoubt, Pulaski led a cavalry charge and took grapeshot from a cannon. He died 2 days later aboard a ship bound for Charleston. For nearly 2 centuries, the story seemed to end there. Monuments went up. Fort Pulaski got its name. In 2009, he was made an honorary U.S. citizen. The biggest debate was about where he was buried, at sea or secretly near Savannah, but in the 1990s, when the Monterey Square monument was being repaired, workers found a skeleton inside the tomb, and the story took a sharp turn, from historical epic to forensic science procedural. The skeleton, particularly its pelvic structure, had features that were undeniably female. Years of study followed. A 2019 DNA analysis matched the remains to one of Pulaski's known maternal relatives, confirming it was almost certainly him. The conclusion, the celebrated father of the American Cavalry, likely had an intersex condition. The revelation doesn't change the record of what he did at Brandywine or in the smoke near Spring Hill, but it radically reframes the man himself. A Polish noble who fought for liberty on 2 continents while carrying a secret he likely never had the words to describe. As the researchers wrote, this finding adds a new layer to the story of the general, suggesting he was a man who, during his entire life, was likely aware he was different. I stood in the square where his monument catches the afternoon light and thought about that phrase. likely aware he was different. It might be the most understated sentence in the entire forensic literature. A man who could not explain himself to 18th century medicine rode into grapeshot for a country that was not his own. Franklin spotted the talent. Washington confirmed it. Savannah kept the body. And the body, 2 centuries on, had one more thing to say. Franklin, it turned out, had a knack for finding exactly the right kind of misfit. Franklin's French forays, sabres, Savannah and snakes. Pulaski wasn't the only misfit Franklin shipped across the Atlantic. From his diplomatic post in Paris, he was running what amounted to the 18th century's most consequential recruiting agency, scouting European military talent with the eye of a Medici patron shopping for sculptors. Only his medium was infantry tactics and cavalry doctrine. His other marquee acquisition was a certain Baron von Steuben, a man whose claim to being a Prussian lieutenant general was, shall we say, a masterpiece of speculative fiction. Franklin essentially approved a resume so embellished it made its subject seem less like a career officer and more like the god of war on a gap year. It was the 18th century equivalent of listing synergy and paradigm shifting as your core competencies when your main skill is just showing up on time. Von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778, barely spoke English, and within months had drilled Washington's ragged Continentals into something resembling a professional army. The resume was fraudulent. The results were not. Franklin's role extended well beyond the Continental Army's head of human resources. He was also its long-distance strategic consultant. When word of the failed Siege of Savannah reached Paris, he processed the grim particulars of D'Estaing's disastrous truce, the fortified killing ground it produced, and the catastrophic frontal assault that followed. Based on that strained and ultimately ruinous Franco-American effort, he sent counsel to Washington, advising a more measured approach to Allied cooperation. A diplomatic way of saying, perhaps we let them handle the catering next time, but we plan the main assault. And when caution and recruitment both failed, Franklin deployed his sharpest weapon, a wit so dry it could be classified as a fire hazard. To protest Britain's policy of shipping convicts to the colonies, he penned a modest proposal. He suggested, with the utmost seriousness, that America should repay this generosity by shipping a few thousand rattlesnakes to England. He outlined a plan to deposit these most mischievous of all the reptiles in the King's Gardens and the fashionable parks of London. It was a perfect piece of diplomatic jiu-jitsu, using the Crown's own absurd logic against it. The man was the founding father of weaponized sarcasm. This, I realized, standing in a city where Franklin's recruits had bled and his strategic advice had arrived too late to save them, was the true art of statecraft. Not just grand treaties, but the subtle knowledge of when to recruit a hero, when to fudge a resume, and when to threaten your enemy with a crate of angry serpents. As Franklin reportedly put it, we are all born ignorant, but one must work hard to remain stupid. Every misfit he found, every letter he wrote, fed into the orbit of one man. The commander who had nearly lost his life at Brandywine until a Polish exile rallied a rearguard. The general whose army von Steuben transformed from militia into fighting force. The president who, years after the guns went quiet, would come south to see what all the bleeding had built. Dual Washingtons, Savannah's squares, sieges, and slavery. Washington came south to see what all the bleeding had built. I walked into the hushed green of Washington Square thinking about that, about how Franklin could ship ideas as easily as jokes, how he had mailed Pulaski across the Atlantic with a letter of introduction, and the package arrived in 1777 labeled Hero of Liberty. Later, Pulaski would gallop into Savannah and never ride out. History, like morning coffee, can be both invigorating and a little bitter at the end. The square's live oaks framed the air like a careful sentence. and I tried to picture Washington's 1791 visit landing here with ceremonial heels. He reached Savannah on May 12th and stayed 4 days. The nation's first president doing a road trip before road trips. Part goodwill tour, part inspection, part, is this place working yet? The city returned the favor by naming this very ground for him in the 1790s. Naming a square is how towns leave Yelp reviews for presidents. I cut over to Reynolds Square, where the evening once swayed in the long room of the silk filature. There, Washington attended a ball, the most Georgian of verbs for a city already practiced at hospitality. I could almost hear the music testing the rafters while the commander-in-chief did his best dignified glide, the only man in America who could dance a minuet and stabilize a currency at the same time. Later, he dined at Brown's Coffee House with the Society of the Cincinnati, a meeting of veterans whose title sounds like a club for stoic salad enthusiasts, but was nothing of the sort. The society, founded in 1783, drew its name from Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, the Roman dictator who relinquished power and returned to his plough, a story Washington's officers like to see as their own. On St. James, today's Telfair Square, he lodged in a house that is now a footnote with an address. The streets still throw off heat from bricks old enough to have met him. On Sunday, May 15th, he attended services at Christ Church off Johnson Square, one of those calm rooms where time sits up straighter. Bells carry cleanly across the squares, and you can almost hear the kind of politeness that doubles as policy. Afterward, he toured the ruined revolutionary earthworks with General Lachlan Mackintosh, walking the scars with a man who had made some of them. Mackintosh had commanded the 1st Georgia Battalion at the siege and knew the ground the way a surgeon knows a patient's chart. Every city keeps its report cards somewhere. Savannah stored one in the dirt. By the river, the wind spoke that brackish dialect only ports understand, which is probably why Washington later decreed Jekyll Island one of 5 major ports of entry during his first term. The coast is not shy about telling you where the country begins, or ends, or pauses for breath. He also crossed the Savannah River to Mulberry Grove and dined with Catherine Greene, the widow of his former commander, General Nathaniel Greene. It reads like a short sentence in a ledger, but the table would have had more history than bread. Nathaniel Greene had been given the plantation by Georgia as thanks for his southern campaign, yet never saw it turn a profit. He died of sunstroke there in 1786 at 43, leaving Catherine with a 1,200-acre estate and debts that eventually consumed it. The dinner was a courtesy call on a woman whose family had already paid more than was owed. All of it loops back through the city's earlier catastrophe in 1779, the failed siege I had been tracing through Franklin's letters and Pulaski's last charge. Did Washington think about that when the music started in the long room? The question hangs in the air like dust motes in window light, visible, untouchable, and always moving. The arc between Pulaski's rescue at Brandywine and his death at Savannah is short enough to draw with a yardstick and long enough to fill a monument. Not every thread from Washington's story sits comfortably in a square's quiet. He purchased a man named Harry Washington in 1763, when the British promised freedom to enslaved people who reached their lines. Harry Washington seized the offer in 1776. At the war's end, George Washington pressed for the return of former slaves. British Commander Guy Carleton refused to surrender those freed under British protection. Harry Washington was evacuated to Nova Scotia on July 31, 1783. His name written into the Book of Negroes, a register of roughly 3,000 black Loyalists compiled by British officials before the fleet left New York. Sometimes history announces itself with fanfare. Other times it signs a ledger and walks to a ship. On Monterey Square, the Congregation of Mikveh Israel keeps letters from early presidents, including a reply from Washington, proof that religious liberty was not just something he talked about over punch beneath chandeliers. Founded by the same Sephardic families who arrived in Oglethorpe's colony in 1733, the congregation had maintained itself through revolution and occupation, and Washington's letter, written in 1790, assured them that the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. The paper is the kind of quiet that outlasts noise. Light Horse Harry Lee, the cavalryman Washington trusted and the father of Robert E. Lee, later tried to sum the man up, and did in one unblinking line: first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. It is the kind of sentence that eats the rest of the page. I drifted back toward Washington Square, past iron fences cooled by shade and a stray scent of coffee that had forgotten its owner. Here the president's 4-day visit became a permanent noun. Here Pulaski's charge still rides, if only in the stubborn way memory circles a city like a sentry. I pressed my palm to the cool iron of the marker. Nothing remained but the small, durable idea that a visit can turn into a name. But Pulaski was not the only man who rode into that October assault and carried Savannah's lessons into a larger world. Among the French contingent that stormed the Spring Hill redoubt were soldiers from a Caribbean colony who had traveled even farther than he had, and whose war was only beginning. Rearguard to Royalty, Christophe's Savannah Crucible. Liberty here wore plain boots and a powdered wig. In the Caribbean it tried on epaulettes and, eventually, a crown. After walking with Washington through his Savannah memories, the polite dances and ruined earthworks and the letter that promised bigotry no sanction, I took a deliberate detour to ask an impolite question. What happens when your president decides to be a king? I aimed my feet toward Franklin Square, past live oaks drooping like they'd missed their cue, and found the bronze monument that seems to answer with a drumbeat. The Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue stand there in heroic freeze-frame, a mixed chorus of free men of color from the French colony that would become Haiti. The sun had warmed the metal, and the drummer boy at the front looked ready to lift his sticks and call strangers to order. Guides like to say that drummer is Henri Christophe. The plaque is careful, the story is bolder. Christophe, born enslaved but free by 1779, was one of them. Modern retellings cast him as the teenage drummer at the Siege of Savannah, though his exact role doesn't change the fact that he was here when French sails appeared and the Franco-American army tried to yank the city back from Britain. The French expedition left Cap Français on August 15th. Reached Savannah on September 8th, and by October 18th the whole bloody business had sputtered out. He was likely back in the Caribbean no later than 1780, carrying home something Americans claim as export, experience, and a taste for liberty. Standing in the square, I tried to see the battle in the street grid. I already knew the shape of October 9th, the Allied columns advancing, the British answering with disciplined fire from works strengthened by enslaved labor, Pulaski charging and falling. What I hadn't fully appreciated until I stood at this monument was the role of the men cast in bronze beside me. The Chasseurs Volontaires, over 500 strong and one of the largest organized groups of soldiers of African descent to fight in the American Revolution, held their ground during the retreat. They served as the rear guard while the rest of the army stumbled back through smoke and shouting, keeping discipline where panic wanted the field. Some historians note the Haitians outnumbered the Americans at the battle. Either way, that rear-guard grit stopped a bad day from becoming a catastrophe. The irony of the place does not whisper. It clears its throat. Free men of color fought for a city where liberty could be discussed in a coffee house while people remained in bondage nearby. A decade later, In 1791, Christophe and his compatriots would light the Haitian Revolution. He rose as a general, and in 1811 he was crowned King Henri I of the Kingdom of Haiti, which is one way to settle an argument about how firmly you intend to hold power. Washington politely refused a crown and rode off into national myth. Christophe accepted one and rode into the harder work of holding a country together while the world calculated exchange rates on his downfall. The square kept humming, traffic on Bryan Street, a faint smell of wet brick, a gull misled by the gleam of a leftover sandwich wrapper. I read the inscription again. The chasseurs sailed in August, hit Savannah in September, bled in October, and went home by 1780. A drummer, or maybe a private with a drum sometimes, spent a month in this city and took away lessons that would help build and then crown a nation. I glanced once more at the bronze, which looked like a drum roll arrested mid-stroke, and headed on. In a town where Washington danced through a ball and Pulaski fell from a saddle, why shouldn't a teenage fighter learn his trade here and later wear a crown? What, after all, is liberty without the audacity to decide what comes next? Christophe decided, and the deciding nearly consumed him. Citadel and Crown, Christophe's fortified northern kingdom. Under Savannah's bronze drummer, history keeps drumming. The boy grew into a general, then further. My phone, a cold oracle of glass and metal, hummed with dates as I traced his climb from the square where I stood, each year like a rung on a ladder you either grab or miss, and then you fall. Christophe attached himself to Toussaint Louverture early in the Revolution's churn, learned the trade of war like a man cramming for the orals, and by 1801 he held command at Cap Français. Then Napoleon sent General Leclerc in early 1802 to reassert French control, a courteous phrase for "bring chains." Christophe refused to hand over the keys. On February 4, 1802, as French ships pressed in, he ordered Cap Français burned. Not theatrical, not symbolic. Wood, sugar, warehouses, homes, fire as policy. If you're hearing the "this is fine" dog meme, flip it. Christophe made sure everything was not fine for the invaders. The scorched earth play was meant to stall the French, deny them a beachhead, and keep his army intact. The decision left ash in the air and time on the clock. And those two things are oddly related. With Louverture captured later that year, Christophe became a pillar under Jean-Jacques Dessalines in the northern campaigns. Fighting and yellow fever worked together like two grim quartermasters. The last French stronghold broke at Vertières on November 18, 1803, just south of Christophe's old post. Independence followed on January 1, 1804, and if the revolution were a stage, Christophe had been the man on the catwalks, lighting fires and cutting ropes so the whole set would finally crash the way it needed to. Peace, such as it was, did not arrive with soft edges. Dessalines, now emperor, moved between February and April 1804 to eliminate remaining French colonists as a security measure. Christophe, the senior commander in the north, carried out the policy there. The following year, during a campaign into Spanish Santo Domingo, Dominican memoirist Gaspar de Arredondo y Pichardo later accused Haitian columns under Christophe of massacres in Mocha and Santiago during the retreat. Historians agree pillage and killings occurred. They disagree on numbers and reliability. The memoir itself came decades later under the shadow of nationalist arguments, which is the historical version of reading a review from someone who already hates the restaurant. Ugly facts remain. The math of it is still argued. On October 17, 1806, Dessalines was killed near Pont Rouge by Port-au-Prince. The end of a ruler, the start of an argument. Senior officers had grown angry with his unyielding labor policies. Into the vacuum stepped two men with fewer shared views than shared scars. Christophe in the north, Alexandre Pétion in the south and west. A constitutional convention produced a new frame in 1806 designed by Pétion's allies, featuring a weak executive balanced by a powerful Senate. Christophe refused to wear a crown made of paper. He would not be a figurehead under a Senate he did not control, and the debate moved from pen to musket. The Battle of Sibert in January 1807 settled nothing on the field and everything on the map. Haiti split in two. Pétion set up a republic in the south and west. Christophe drew back to the Plaine du Nord, took hold of the north, and renamed Cap Français as Cap Henri, which is one way to say where you stand without raising your voice. On February 17, 1807, the Northern Army chose him, President and Generalissimo of the state of Haiti. The title fit like a uniform that allows no shrug. His rule was rigid and martial, a machine built to make export agriculture pay again. Plantations ran under military discipline. He sought British trade to keep the French at sea, a practical chess move dressed as commerce. And he built. Sans Souci rose, an executive residence with a name that dared fate to create care. Above it, in the mountains, he directed work on the Citadelle Laferrière, whose foundations were being tamped as early as 1805. Its walls still look like they were poured from threat itself, a colossal redoubt intended as the last word if the French ever came back. I stood in a Savannah square reading about limestone on a Haitian ridge, the heat on stone, lime on skin, hammer strikes echoing from ridge to ridge. A fortress that turns a mountain into a sentence. All of this required money, and money required labor. Christophe's state enforced a regimented corvée that bound rural people to plantations under close supervision. He defended it as disciplined nation-building. Scholars have called it harsh. The logic was contractual without the paycheck. His later legal code, the Code Henri of 1812, wrote the system down in formal ink, including a plantation share for laborers in lieu of wages. By then, the North was drilled, fortified, and organized around a single will. The only thing left was to match title to reality. Clang. And on June 2nd, 1811, Christophe crowned himself King Henri I, the northern state now a kingdom. A drummer boy cast in bronze on a Savannah square had become a sovereign, and the question was no longer whether he could seize power, but whether he could hold it. Sans souci to Citadelle. Crown, code, corvée, collapse. When the story of your rise to power concludes with you placing a crown on your own head, what exactly is the protocol for the next morning? After you've fought for freedom, torched your own cities to deny them to an enemy, and split your nation in two. Inventing a monarchy from scratch seems like a particularly ambitious form of paperwork. For King Henri I, the answer was simple. Build a nation so formidable and so fortified that the world, and especially France, would have no choice but to take it seriously. His first order of business was to look the part. To prove Haiti was the equal of any European power, he created a hereditary nobility, a move unique in the newly independent Americas. This was no half-hearted effort. He went all in, bestowing titles on his loyal officers that sounded like they were plucked from a breakfast menu. Thus the world was introduced to the Duke of Lemonade and the Count of Marmalade. While this may sound like a legislative act passed by a man in the grip of a powerful sugar craving, it was a deadly serious attempt to project stability and create a European-style aristocracy. Of course, a court full of fruity dukes needs funding. The Code Henri, which I'd already been reading about on my phone in the Savannah heat, revealed its full scope in his kingship. The corvée system I'd noted earlier wasn't just a wartime expedient, it was the fiscal engine of the entire kingdom. Article 3 of the code generously outlined that laborers would receive a share of the plantation's output in lieu of wages, which is a bit like your boss offering you a percentage of the office printer paper instead of a paycheck. The money from that regimented agriculture paid for schools established with help from British abolitionists like William Wilberforce for the army and for the building projects that consumed Christophe's ambition like fuel. The Sans-Souci Palace at Millau was meant to rival Versailles, but the Citadelle Laferrière, whose foundations had been tamped since 1805 on the mountain above it, was the true obsession. 15 years and the sweat of thousands went into that fortress, stocked with enough provisions to sustain 5,000 soldiers for a year and bristling with 365 cannons, one for every day of potential invasion. The citadel was the ultimate expression of Christophe's fear of a French return. The great irony is that this immense weapon of war never fired a single cannon in anger. Its purpose fulfilled simply by existing. Like a scarecrow so terrifying that not even the crows dare to report it to the crow authorities. But an iron fist can only grip so tightly for so long. The same forced labor that built the kingdom bred a deep and simmering resentment. By 1820, the breaking point was near. In August of that year, the physically imposing king suffered a massive stroke while attending Mass, leaving him partially paralyzed. The news spread like fire, and the simmering resentment boiled over. His own generals led a rebellion, marching on sans souci. Cornered and facing the collapse of everything he had built, King Henri Christophe chose his own exit on the evening of October 8, 1820. Legend insists he did so with a silver bullet, a final theatrical act of royal defiance. Fearing the revolutionaries would desecrate his body, a few loyal followers carried their fallen king up the steep mountain path to the citadel. There, in the heart of his crowning achievement, they buried him in a pit of quicklime. The kingdom vanished almost overnight. His son and heir was killed days later, and the north was quickly reunified with the Southern Republic under Jean-Pierre Boyer. Yet something of the king's ambition outlasted the king. His wife and daughters, who had wisely invested a fortune in Europe, were allowed to leave. They settled into comfortable exile in Pisa, Italy, which is a reasonable place to land if your alternative is a pit of quicklime. An earthquake in 1842 reduced Sans-Souci to romantic ruins. The citadel survived. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, 3,000 feet above sea level on a Haitian ridge. A fortress that never fired in anger, built by a man who started as a drummer boy in a unit that fought in the city where I was standing. I looked up from my phone. The bronze figure on the monument hadn't moved, of course, but something in the proportions felt different now. A boy, a general, a king, a body in quicklime, a fortress on a mountain. Savannah's squares have a habit of holding more than shade and benches. This one held an entire arc from colony to kingdom, and the only thread connecting the two endpoints was the stubborn human conviction that you can build your way out of history's worst intentions. Whether that works is a question the citadel answers by simply refusing to fall down. Rung bells, shut doors, Savannah shrimp, gators, and dusk. We pocketed our phones and walked over to the SCAD Museum of Art, a modest trek I conducted with the gravity of a royal procession. I'd never really gone to that part of campus before, maybe once, dimly, but it's all renovated now, bright and confident. The exhibitions pulled me along like a freight train that had learned good manners. The building wears its past in plain view. The museum sits on the bones of the 1853 Central of Georgia Railway Export Warehouse, built from Savannah grey brick and folded into what is now the only surviving antebellum railroad complex in the country. Back then, the warehouse was a sequence of rentable bays split by firewalls. Today, SCAD has threaded galleries through those same breaks, so you step from freight-era masonry into present-day art. with the same rhythm merchants once used to count cotton bales. Opened in 2011 after a careful conversion, the place is a teaching museum with more than 20 exhibitions a year. Its holdings include the Walter O. Evans collection of African-American art, and the André Léon Talley Gallery does for fashion what a good tailor does for seams, stitching couture's catwalk bravado to the workrooms of design students. An industrial shell that once shipped goods now ships ideas. A neat trick in a city that likes its past and its progress in the same frame. The final exhibition was a corridor lined with bells, each a different size, each with its own personality. The artist originally wanted visitors to ring them freely, which of course produced the soundscape of 1,000 lost ships making distress calls at once. Order returned in the form of 2 docents standing guard, serene referees in a league of polite chaos. We had to ask them to ring the bells for us. When they did, each bell answered with a distinct tone and a unique design. The perfect museum paradox. Interactive art you are not allowed to touch. Sound that needs a chaperone. We headed downtown and past the Lady and Sons, Paula Dean's one-time juggernaut at 102 West Congress. It closed earlier this year, which felt surreal in a city that still sells postcards of it. Dean started in 1989 with the Bag Lady, meals packed at home and run around town by her sons, before turning it into a 3-story restaurant famous for fried chicken, collards and hoe cakes. In the 2000s it became a tourism engine, routinely feeding more than 1,000 people a day and giving the surrounding shops a halo. Then, July 31st, 2025, was the last service. The announcement said the family would focus on 4 Paula Dean's family kitchen locations in other states. Everyone else did the math. No buffet anymore, higher costs in a historic space, rising competition, and the sort of post-pandemic changes that make even a sure thing wobbly. A place built on abundance downsized into memory. Savannah nodded, the way an old port nods when a ship stops calling. For dinner we sailed east to Tybee, to that marsh-fringed institution, the original crab shack at 40 Estill Hammock Road, right on Chimney Creek. The vibe is picnic tables, paper-covered trays, and the immortal promise, where the elite eat in their bare feet. It was Pirate Week, so the place overflowed with buccaneers, all tricorns and tankards. I worried we wouldn't get a table. We did, though it came with a side of lively children. The peace and quiet packed their bags, but the food solved every grievance on the docket. I ordered a full pound of shrimp and demolished it with the kind of focus usually reserved for finals week. Around us, platters of low country boil and Captain Crab's samplers rose like edible monuments. Shrimp, crab legs, mussels or crawfish, corn, sausage, potatoes, heaped in a way that would have pleased any quartermaster. The crab shack keeps a small gator lagoon for gawking, which we dutifully did. We'd come in on a day of very high tide. It had receded by the time we arrived, but earlier, as we drove onto the island, we passed a dead gator on the road, a grim reminder that not all wildlife reads the signage. Tybee loves its pageantry. The Buccaneer Ball that kicks off the Pirate Fest is part of this place's seasonal heartbeat. But the marsh doesn't care. It lifts, it drops, it keeps its own calendar. After dinner we grabbed snacks at a local grocery and headed back. I walked down to the beach for a quick reconnaissance. The wind blew hard and cold, and the sand stung my legs like a drill sergeant's critic. I stayed long enough to catch the tail end of a sunset, thin as a promise but still worth the faceful of grit. We watched Broken Arrow that night, art we couldn't ring and a bomb no one should. That's a wrap on Chapter 2, and honestly, standing in front of a B-47 that connects to your own grandfather's flight log while a lost nuclear bomb still sits somewhere off the coast, that's the kind of collision between the personal and the absurd that keeps me chasing these stories. Next time, we're heading back to Wormslow, where a tunnel of live oaks leads straight into colonial defense, Gullah/Geechee heritage at pinpoint, and a near-miss love story I didn't even know about until the tides literally are-directed the whole day. So until then, if you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Palmetto Bugs and Broken Arrows. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Thanks for listening to The Rise the Limit, and I'll catch you on the next one.